Hello everybody, welcome back to a new video. My name is Sarah and today I'm going to be giving you 26 book recommendations for the 26 years that I have been alive. So today is not my birthday, but sometime like last week, April 4th was my birthday, and so I'm a little late posting this video, but I wanted to do some sort of book recommendation video for my birthday, and I saw Jean from Bookishthoughts and Ashley from AFrolicThroughFiction do something similar where they did X number of book recommendations for X number of years that they have been alive. And so I kind of pulled inspiration from both of their videos to do something similar. So I turned 26 this year, and so I'm kind of leaning a little more towards how Jean did her recommendations, where she had her viewers give her prompts, like they asked her for specific types of book recommendations, and then Ashley broke up her life into certain age points and gave books that she loved during that time period. I'm going more towards Jean's route. I've actually taken some of her book recommendation prompts, and then I've also created some of my own based off of common book recommendations that I hear people looking for, and just some things that I came up with on my own. And then there are two that my husband gave me that you will know which ones they are when you hear them, because they're wild. So I will link both Ashley and Jean's videos down below. I do want to say, when I go through these books, there are 26 of them, and I do tend to ramble on in my videos. I'm going to try to keep my synopses and explanations as brief as possible. I will of course link all the books and their Goodreads synopses down below in the description if you want to look into them further, but I'm really just going to try to zip through these as fast as possible so that this video doesn't become like 10 hours long. We're just gonna get started. The first prompt is a book that I would have loved to give myself 10 years ago, and that would be Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. Now, I know you've probably seen a Sarah J. Maas book and you're rolling your eyes because everybody recommends Sarah J. Maas, and I will be honest, you will see another one of hers pop up later in this list. I really would have wanted to give myself this book 10 years ago. I would have been about 16, so middle of high school. I absolutely adore this series. We follow Selena Sardathian as she is entered into this contest to become the king's assassin, and while she's there, she starts finding out some hidden, mysterious, nefarious things that are going on in the kingdom, and the story really just completely explodes from that point. By the time you get to like the third book, even in this 7-book series, you wouldn't even guess that we had started during this first book's plotline. It takes itself on this really crazy journey, and I really, as much as I loved it when I read it in my early 20s, I think I was like 20 actually when I picked up this book the first time, I think I would have loved it just even more, if that's even possible, when I was 16. This is exactly the type of story that I was looking for back then. I think this would have been a good book series to help me delve much deeper into fantasy at a much earlier age. I didn't really start making the deep dig into fantasy until I got out of college, I feel like. I've always loved fantasy, but I feel like I've just really scraped the surface of what the genre has to offer and only really explored the popular YA titles. And obviously this is a popular YA title, but because it's such a long series of 7 books that this is the thinnest book, they get much larger than this by like the 3rd book. I feel like I would have really gotten the fantasy bug a lot faster if I would have picked this up a lot earlier. So the second prompt that I did get from Jean was your favorite book with a dragon in it, and that would be Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. Are we surprised that I put a Samantha Shannon book on this list? I adored the Priory of the Orange Tree. This is definitely an epic fantasy book that involves several different kingdoms that all have several different beliefs about dragons, interactions and histories with dragons. You've got some that worship dragons, you've got some that fear dragons. There are warriors that ride dragons into battle. There's another kingdom that has a queen whose lineage has been keeping a dragon in slumber for years and years and years, and in order for her to keep her kingdom protected from this sleeping dragon, she has to give birth to a daughter. And so, you know, the story really delves into the idea of motherhood and marriage and a woman's role in the world and just her life in general. It's a beautiful book. I highly, highly recommend it if you're looking for a book about dragons, or a book that involves dragons in any way. So the third prompt, I actually have 3 recommendations for. The prompt is a book that you love that is about reading. And so the first book that I have is a middle grade. Actually, it's kind of an older middle grade. It was coming out when I was in grade school, middle school, and it is Ink Heart by Cornelia Funk. So this is the first book in a trilogy. I'm gonna be honest, I've only ever read the first 2 books. I never did get around to reading the last one, but it is basically about a girl who, if she reads out loud, the characters from whatever book that she's reading can come to life, but something from her world has to take the place of that character in the book. And so it's about how she loves to read, but she's always afraid to read aloud, and one day she accidentally does, and I think her father gets sucked into the book, and so it's her going on this journey to find him and bring him back to her world. And it's just this really magical book. I loved the idea of being sucked into fairy tales and exploring. I found myself going back to that book constantly, and rereading it growing up, and I really, really loved it. And then the other book that I have, again, Are We Surprised? It's The Starlet C by Erin Morgenstern. Now, this one is a very hit or miss book as to whether or not you like it. It's very experimental, I feel, in the way it's written and the way that the plot is structured. I do have a video explaining my thoughts on this plot. It is a bit spoilery, so beware if you go and check that out, but I'll link it down below. But this is about a boy who is in college, and he finds a book that has a memory of his written down in the book, and it's a memory that nobody should know. There's no way it could be written down. So he goes on this journey to figure out how this memory came to be in this book and how somebody knows about it, and he stumbles across the Starlet Sea and a harbor on the Starlet Sea, which is this underground library filled with books where people either go to protect stories, to guard them, to curate them, or to just enjoy them. And it's really, this story is really kind of a love letter to readers and story lovers in general, and I just really fell in love with this book, and it really just made me love storytelling all the more. The third book that I have is If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler by I think it's Italo Calvino. This is another really experimental book. It's really strange. It's written in second person, and it is about you picking up this new book, reading it, only to discover that the book is missing a bunch of pages. So you go and you find the publisher and you're like, what the heck, there's just missing pages. They give you a new one, and it turns out that's not even the same book that you read before, and you go kind of in this spiral of getting all these different new books that have either missing pages, or it's a different story, or the story changes in the middle of the book, and you're kind of trying to figure out what is the correct book. And it's really about a reader's experience while reading a book. So it's a lot of fun, but it's definitely a strange book to read. So the next prompt is a favorite children's book that I loved to read when I was a child. So if we're talking picture books, I definitely would say that my favorite would be Owl Babies. I read this book like every day in preschool. Even before I even really knew how to read, I had the story memorized after it being read to me so many times by my parents, and I just found a lot of comfort in the pictures. And it's basically about these 3 owl siblings who wake up in the middle of the night and their mom is missing, and it's just kind of the story of how mom always comes back, and you know, you gotta be brave, and it's a really sweet story that I absolutely adored when I was a child. And then if we're talking about middle grade books, I think I would have to suggest The Tale of a Despero. So this book is this really whimsical fairy tale about a mouse with 2 large ears, a princess, and a maid, and how their stories all kind of come together, and they're each kind of a hero in their own story, and it's just a really sweet fairy tale that it was another one that I found myself constantly rereading because I loved the writing style, I loved the whimsical fairy tale feel of it, and it was just a really heartwarming story. So the next recommendation is a fantasy novel for someone who's only enjoyed Tolkien fantasy but normally only reads historical fiction. I would definitely recommend The Library of Legends by Janie Chain. So this is definitely a much more historical novel than it is a fantasy novel. It follows a group of Chinese university students in China during the period kind of between World War I and World War II, where China is being attacked by Japan, and the students all go to school on the coast, and so they have to travel, I think it's over like 1,000 miles by foot inland, and while they're traveling on foot inland, they are having their lessons on the road. And it's during this time you've got a couple of students who have to protect what's called the Library of Legends, and it is a collection of Chinese legends and folklore. It's the original copies of these that were housed in the university, and you've got a couple of students who are in charge of protecting them. And while this Library of Legends is on the move, the students that are protecting these ancient stories start to actually see the legends come to life on the road. It really fascinated me to think that this was a real thing. They were real students that really did travel all this way on foot inland and had their lessons on the road. I think it's definitely kind of the pacing of a Tolkien novel, where it's slower paced, and it's much more about a journey and an expedition. The next book is a recommendation for someone who wants to get into sci-fi but hates books set in space. I would recommend The Space Between Worlds by Micah Johnson. Now, obviously it says space in the title, but it's not set in space at all. This deals with alternate dimensions and alternate Earths, and so we're following a character. She's able to travel to over 200 alternate Earths because her counterparts are all dead on those alternate Earths. So it's the story of her traveling to these other Earths through like this alternate dimension portal in order to collect data on them and bring it back to her own Earth for the scientists to study. But while she's doing this, she kind of runs into this information that one of her alternate selves on one of the that remain alive dies under really mysterious circumstances, and so she starts to investigate and starts to realize that this data collection and this travel to alternate Earths is not entirely what it seems. I found it really fascinating. This is a debut novel and I really loved it. Johnson does an incredible job just with her writing style and depicting this story and creating it so that the world feels vast and well built, but she keeps the story very succinct, and you don't feel overwhelmed. You don't feel like you're not getting enough. You feel like you're just getting the right amount of this story, and I really loved it. And she also has a lot of social commentary in this book, which was really fascinating and interesting to read about. And then another one that I actually have would be Hummingbird Salamander by Jeff Vandermeer. Now this is more of a thriller than a sci-fi. but it has sci-fi elements to it, so it's good if you're interested in kind of just starting to leap into the genre. It deals with kind of eco-terrorism, and this our main character Jane gets this letter directing her to a storage unit that holds this taxidermied hummingbird and directions to find a taxidermied salamander, and it was given to her by a presumed to be dead eco-terrorist. And when she removes the taxidermied hummingbird from the storage unit, she then starts a domino effect of events that are much bigger than she is. Like I said, this is definitely much more of a thriller with more sci-fi, subtle sci-fi hints to it and undertones, but I would definitely recommend it if you are looking for something like that. So another prompt is my favorite piece of Gothic literature. Now, I have not read too much Gothic literature. You know, I read Jane Eyre, which is a classic Gothic story, and I read a couple others more recently, and one that I would like to recommend is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. Now, this, obviously, it's a Gothic story. It's got Gothic in the title. This is also kind of a horror story. It's about a young woman in 1950s Mexico, and she gets a letter from her cousin. She just recently married into a white family that lives in a mansion in this kind of more countryside of Mexico. The letter really startles our main character and makes her think that something is wrong and that the marriage is not going as well as would be presumed. And so Noemi, our main character, travels to go stay with her cousin for a little bit and make sure that she's okay. And while she's there, she figures out that the family is quite sinister. There's also stuff to do with mushrooms in this book, but I loved it. It's definitely got a very Gothic atmosphere. It's slow moving in maybe the first half to 2/3. The last third really takes off and is super intense and engaging. The whole story is engaging. I love Noemi as a main character. She's definitely feisty and bold. I think this is a great story, even if you're new to the Gothic genre, like I was when I really picked this up. I'd really only read Jane Eyre before this one, and I fell in love with it. So the next prompt is lighthearted books that make you feel happy to read them, and I actually have 3. The most recent one that I read was actually an Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. This is much more of your like high fantasy-esque story, but it's short. It's like just under 300 pages, and it's about a young woman painter who lives in this world that humans coexist with the fair folk, or fae, but fae cannot create anything. They can't make their own food, their own clothes, they can't paint, they can't do anything that like makes something out of something else, and so they hire humans to do it, and in exchange for different enchantments. And so our main character Isabel is a painter, and she paints the portrait of the Autumn Prince, but when she paints it, she paints in human sorrow onto his face, and any sort of expression of a human emotion is seen as a weakness in fae. And so the Autumn Prince then takes her to the Autumn Court for trial, and on their way there they run into some danger, and things end up taking a turn that is unexpected for them on their journey, and they end up falling in love, and it's just this really sweet, heartwarming story. It like made my heart melt. The 2 main characters are super lovable, even if the Autumn Prince is obnoxious. He's obnoxiously vain and prideful, but in a weirdly endearing way. And I just love both how him and Isabel interact and their dynamic together. The writing and the world building is just very fairy tale-esque and very rich. It just brought a smile to my face, and it was a really sweet story, and I really enjoyed it. So if you're looking for more of a contemporary feel-good novel, I would recommend The Dating Plan by Sarah Desai. This is a contemporary romance, and it follows the kind of fake dating, fake marriage that turns into real dating and real love trope. It's just a really funny story. It's a really sweet story. The 2 main characters just really interact, in a really heartwarming way. There are a couple of like heavier topics, but overall it's just a really endearing, heartwarming story. The main characters definitely have to confront the idea of loving and accepting themselves and seeing themselves as good enough before loving one another. It made me really happy to see that, and I just had a really good time reading this book. So I recommend this if you're looking for more of a heartwarming contemporary. And then if you're looking for a heartwarming low fantasy story, I recommend The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. Now, this does deal with heavier topics such as discrimination and nature versus nurture. It's dealt through kind of the lens of children, and so while it is tough to read at times, in the end, the book as a whole is very heartwarming. The joy and the lightheartedness definitely outweighs the heaviness of this story. It involves our main character, who is an orphanage inspector, and he goes to inspect a orphanage that is on the brink of closing that happens to house several children that are magical in very peculiar and dangerous ways. And it's just a story of our main character getting to know each of these children and realizing the importance of this house and the caretaker and the family that the orphans and the caretaker have built in this house. And it's a really sweet story. I absolutely adored it. It had me laughing out loud at times while reading it. Just the dialogue of the children is hysterically funny, and it's a really good book, and I highly recommend it if you're looking for something that gives you faith in human love and acceptance. So next I'd like to recommend my favorite thriller book, and that would be The Shadows by Alex North. So this also borders kind of on horror a little bit. So it deals with our main character who had left town when he was a teenager because of a murder in his friend group. So he's coming back home because his mother is dying, and while he's there, another teenager shows up dead in a very similar format that the death when he was a teenager occurred. And our main character starts to get really worried because the suspect of the murder when he was a teenager was never caught, and he just completely had disappeared off the face of the earth. So this book kind of tells the murder in present day and the events leading up to the murder in the past parallel to each other. I absolutely loved this book. The plot twists had me completely floored. They were so well done and so unexpected yet believable. Like, after they happened, I was like, oh my god, I should have seen that coming. But he puts the pieces together so intricately and so subtly that I had completely missed it for several of the plot twists. Like, you know, it got to like the third or fourth one and I was like, okay, I've got this. I know what's gonna happen. And boom, he still completely surprised me. And I really loved it. It was creepy. It was fast-paced, and it was a really enjoyable read from start to finish. Like, I really loved this book, and I definitely would recommend it if you're looking for a good thriller that is on the creepier, possibly paranormal side. So the next kind of prompt is a book that lives in my mind rent-free, and that would be I'm Thinking of Ending Things. And this book is so strange and so wild, and that's why, like, I can't stop thinking about it. And I read it like several months ago. I actually listened to it on audiobook, which I do highly recommend because there's this one particular scene that I think the audiobook captures so well, and I feel like you can't quite get the same experience if you're just reading it on the page as you do with the audiobook. This is a book about a young woman who is traveling with her boyfriend in the middle of winter to meet her boyfriend's parents, and while there she is debating with herself on whether or not she should end the relationship after the visit with his parents. And that's about all I can tell you, because it's such a strange book. This is a weird psychological thriller. It's definitely bordering on horror. I think it's definitely it's a healthy mix between thriller and horror. By the time I was done listening to it, I was just completely floored. Like, you think you've pieced together everything, and it's one of those books that you don't know exactly what's going on until the very last sentence. And I'm not even exaggerating when I say the very last sentence. Like, that's how long it takes to finally have the last piece click into place and everything finally makes sense. And when I was done with it, I just kind of sat there and I was like, what did I just listen to? Like, what is happening? And it just, like, I could not stop thinking about it for like a solid week after I listened to it, and still to this day I still have it pop into my head every once in a while. So if you want a weird book that definitely just makes you like question everything that you read, I definitely read I'm Thinking of Ending Things. So I hear people talking about like second chance authors. So people that have read a book by an author and they didn't like it, but they wanted to give an author another chance, and so they read another book by them and ended up really liking it. And so I actually had that happen to me with Christopher Paolini. I did not like the Aragon series at all when I was a child. I just found the first book to be really boring, and it was actually the only book that I've ever like literally fallen asleep reading. But I actually recently picked up To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by him, and I loved this book. So this is a science fiction book if you do like books set in space. It's about a main character who is a xenobiologist, and she goes on these expeditions to newfound planets in order to do research on them and determine them habitable or not. And while she's on her most recent expedition, she ends up stumbling across an ancient alien artifact. Her discovery then sets off a series of intergalactic events that kind of threaten the existence of the human race. It's definitely a space opera. You know, if you like Star Wars, Star Trek, if you like the idea of alien battles, that type of story, I would highly recommend picking this up. There are parts where it's a bit slower, but I personally liked it because I think that it really made the science aspect of this science fiction more believable. I found it to be really, really enjoyable. It is quite hefty. It's about over 800 pages long, but it's definitely worth the read if you're looking for a new space opera to pick up. There was a period when I was in high school where dystopian YA novels were all the rage. Like, that was all that was being published. The Hunger Games, Divergent, The Maze Runner, that whole series of that whole genre of books, that was all the rage. And then YA literature kind of steered away from that, but I still love dystopian novels. And so if you are looking for a dystopian novel that is not young adult, I would recommend Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. So if you've seen the movie Blade Runner, or Blade Runner, I think it's 2049, that's the newest one. Blade Runner, the first one, is inspired by this book. This was actually written in the 1960s, and it feels like a book that could be published today. So it basically, you follow a bounty hunter who goes looking for rogue androids, and it really deals with the idea of what makes something human and what makes something alive, and where do we draw the line of giving something the same rights as a living creature and the same rights as a human. And it's so fascinating to read. I absolutely loved it. It's super short, but the author really made this really vibrant world that is just vibrant but desolate at the same time. So I've also seen quite a few people say that they've kind of fallen out of love with YA novels, but they want to continue reading them. So if you're looking for a YA to reestablish your faith in YA fantasy, I would suggest Rey Bear by Jordan Afueco. This is about a young woman who is sent by her mother to join a contest to become one of the Crown Prince's established 11 closest advisors. If she becomes one of these advisors, she then gets something called the Ray, and is then kind of spiritually bound to the prince and the other 10 advisors in kind of a form storm that's deeper than blood. So the mother tells the young woman to go win a spot on the Crown Prince's Council of 11, and upon winning a spot to then kill the Crown Prince. I absolutely loved this book. I fell in love with the rich world building. I love the characters. I think it's definitely something that has been missing in YA, just the richness of the story itself. I think it's a beautiful debut. And I've actually heard a lot of other people say that they've kind of started to give up on YA, but when they picked up this book, they definitely fell in love, and it had reestablished their love for the genre. So if you're somebody that does love YA fantasy, but wants to kind of break themselves into adult fantasy and is looking for a book to kind of transition themselves into that, I would suggest The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. This is about a young woman, Nari, who lives in ancient Egypt. So she's a con artist, and one day during a con of hers, she accidentally summons a Jinn warrior who then whisks her away to ancient Jinn city, the City of Brass. And when she's there, she realizes that she actually has ties to the city and gets involved with the politics there. It's another one with a really richly developed world. The characters read in a way that they're very easy to connect with. They're very easy to quickly start rooting for, and in a way that reminds me of YA stories. There's a lot more, I guess, complicated court politics than what you would typically find in a YA. There's also, I feel like, more advanced, intricate magic system and history to the world, but it's not something that I think is hard to grasp or get into. So I think it's definitely a good bridge between YA and adult fantasy, and I would highly recommend it because I do think it is a phenomenal story, and it's definitely a beautiful fantasy world that I absolutely enjoyed. So this next recommendation request is from my husband, and this is a quote from him. So word for word, this is how he worded the recommendation. A book that makes it frustrating to wipe your ass because you sat on the toilet reading for too long and your shit dried. Now there's kind of a caveat that comes with the book that I'm about to recommend, but I would recommend House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. Now, for the middle section of this book, it's not one that you would find yourself stuck sitting on the toilet and unable to get up because you can't pull yourself away from the book. It's very slow. However, if you are reading the last 250 pages when you are sitting on the toilet, you are not going to be getting up. Like, this book, like, I could not put it down. You will not be able to tear your eyes away from the page. It is that intense that you will just be completely drawn into it. You will forget where you even are. This follows a book about a young woman who lives in a world that has all sorts of fantasy creatures. You've got humans, you've got fae, werewolves, shapeshifters, nymphs, just everything, angels. There's everything in this world. And so you follow our main character Bryce, who her best friend is the leader of this wolf pack, this werewolf pack, that then gets brutally murdered. So Bryce then becomes a key witness and asset to the investigation, and so she teams up with Hunt, one of the, I guess kind of like a angel who's kind of like a federal agent or whatever, I guess you could call him, to then figure out who the murderer is. This is a murder mystery. This is high fantasy. There's also just a lot more going on with a story beyond that. I was so nervous reading the last 200 pages, I could not put this book down. So if you're looking for a book that is basically unputdownable, and you better not read it on the toilet or you're not going to be able to wipe your butt because the poop will be dried, I would pick up this book. I know a lot of BookTube likes their myth retellings, particularly their Greek myth retellings. I wanted to recommend a book that is inspired by Greek mythology, but not necessarily a myth retelling, and so I wanted to recommend Lore by Alexandra Bracken. So this is about a kind of this underground society that every 7 years participates in something called the Aegon, and it's this event that lasts for 7 days where the ancient Greek gods and goddesses all become mortal for 7 days, and these different houses that descend from the ancient Greek heroes are all chasing after them for a chance to kill one of the Greek gods or goddesses and then gain their immortality and their powers. And it follows our main character Lore, who had escaped from that world from the last Aegon when her parents were brutally murdered right after the event had ended, but she finds herself drawn back in by the Greek goddess Athena and from an old friend who asks for her help. This is a super fast-paced book. It is intense. It takes a lot into discussion of the Greek myths and kind of how we glorify a lot of things that shouldn't really be glorified in Greek mythology. It also talks about women's roles in Greek mythology and how things have been kind of skewed to turn some of the women into villains when really they were victims. It's a very action-packed story, and I definitely recommend it if you enjoy Greek mythology but you're wanting a kind of a new spin on the genre. So the next book prompt recommendation is another one from my husband. This one is a little less crude, and it is a book that makes you want to wear flannel and be cozy, but instead of drinking hot chocolate you end up drinking whiskey. And so I asked him what he meant by that, just for a little bit of clarification, and he said a kind of low-key cozy book that you did not expect to be on the darker side of things. And so I'm recommending Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I definitely did not anticipate where this story went. So we follow our main character Piranesi, who lives in this house that has a seemingly unending amount of rooms that house countless statues, as well as the ocean and the sky and clouds. And it just kind of is supposed to follow how he thinks that he's the only one that lives in this house, and he soon finds out that that's not the case. I went into this thinking it was going to be much more whimsical than what it is. It takes a rather dark turn. However, I loved where the story went. I loved this book from beginning to end. Like, even when it was whimsical, before it became dark, I was loving it. When it took the dark turn, I was like, whoa, but I was also like, okay, I'm interested. You've got my attention even more now. It's only about 250 pages, so it's a quick read. Highly recommend it if that's kind of something that you're looking for. Something that kind of catches you off guard with where the book turns, and it turns kind of like in a darker direction. So the next book that I'm going to recommend is a book that feels like a Victorian era classic but actually has been written in present day, and that is Zinc Jar by Jess Kidd. So this book feels almost like a Sherlock Holmes novel. However, we follow a female detective. It is set in Victorian era London, and we follow our main character Bridie, who is our Sherlock Holmes-esque detective, as she is looking into the disappearance of a young girl who has rather peculiar characteristics. She's described as kind of fish-like, and we kind of go down this rabbit hole of kind of what is fiction, what is myth, and what is actually real. And it was just a really well done novel. It's a really well done mystery novel. The writing style it's very Victorian era. So it makes it really feel like a classical era. It really adds to the atmosphere of the Victorian novel, and it just has that classic Sherlock Holmes vibe with giving it a feminist spin, and just with a really lovable, weird, quirky cast of characters, and I just thoroughly enjoyed this book. And so if you're looking for kind of a different take on a Sherlock Holmes-esque story, I would definitely recommend this book. So the next recommendation that I have is a book to get you out of a reading slump. slump, and that would be The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon. Again, are we surprised that I'm recommending this? You shouldn't be at this point, but I truly do think that this is a good book to get you out of a reading slump because of the turn that it takes very early on. So it takes place in I think 2050 London, and it's in a world where clairvoyants have always existed. However, it's illegal to be clairvoyant, and our main character, Paige Mahoney, is a very rare type of clairvoyant, and one day she gets arrested and taken to this prison, which turns out to not be a type of prison that she is expecting. From there, the story kind of really takes off in a direction that I personally never expected, and I hear a lot of other people say the same thing, and I think because of that, it is one that I think hooks you really fast. Also, just the world building, and even in the very beginning of the story when we're first meeting Paige, I think it really draws the reader in really well. I think Samantha Shannon just does a really good job of that. I think that's one of the best qualities of her writing. Meanwhile, I love every single thing about her writing, but I definitely think her strongest quality is her world building. So yeah, if you're in a reading slump, I definitely recommend picking this book up. And the last book that I have to recommend is a horror novel that is accessible to people that aren't very accustomed to the genre, and that would be Horrid by Katrina Leno. So this book, it's a YA horror, which is one of the reasons why I think it's easier to get into if you are not used to the genre, or if you're just wanting to start in the genre. It follows a young girl whose father's just died, and so her and her mother move back across country to her mother's childhood home, and while there, some really weird things start happening. The young girl starts kind of uncovering things about her mother's childhood that she had never known about, and so it definitely pulls on the haunted house trope of horror novels. However, I think it does it in a way that's kind of newer. There were certain events that I had actually never seen used in the haunted house horror trope, and I really enjoyed it. It's not terribly scary. However, I still think it is very engaging for people who are more veterans of the horror genre. I still think there are aspects of it that would catch you off guard while not being overly scary and overly gory or anything like that. So I think it's a good starting place, and it's also a good book to pick up if you are more of a veteran of the genre. That should add up to 26 books. I know I had a couple prompts that had more than one, so not 26 prompts, but 26 books. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you've read any of these books, I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. If I've kind of piqued your interest in any of them, let me know down in the comments. I hope you consider sticking around and subscribing, but I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!